The 86-year-old woman's hands shook as the city inspector slapped the citation down on her porch railing. $3,000, ma'am. And if I catch you feeding those animals again, it's jail time, he said, loud enough for her neighbors to hear. She tried to explain through trembling lips, but he cut her off. I don't care if you're broke, figure it out, and kicked over the small bowl of cat food at her feet. She apologized, wiping her eyes, as he took photos of her crying for his report. He was walking back to his truck, satisfied, when he noticed something carved into the wooden post beside her front door. His hand froze on the door handle. Because those 5 words explained exactly why every cat in that yard was there, and why what he'd just done was about to destroy his career. Her name was Lillian Mosher, and she was 86 years old. Lillian had lived in the same house on Crescent Street for 54 years. It was a small bungalow with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch that creaked when you walked on it. The roof needed replacing. The gutters were falling off in places. The yard was overgrown, wildflowers and weeds tangled together in a way that looked accidental, but that Lillian secretly loved. She couldn't afford a landscaper, couldn't do the work herself anymore, so nature had taken over. It suited her fine. She and her husband Bernard had bought the house in 1970 for $18,000, a sum that had seemed impossible at the time. Bernard had worked at the paper mill for 39 years, came home every night smelling like wood pulp and chemicals, his hands rough and stained. Lillian had worked part-time at the elementary school cafeteria, serving lunch to children who called her Mrs. Mosher and sometimes hugged her legs when they were sad. They'd been good years, hard but good. They'd never had children of their own. They'd tried. 3 miscarriages before the doctor had finally told them it wasn't going to happen. Lillian had grieved quietly, the way women of her generation did, burying the pain somewhere deep and trying not to think about it. Bernard had grieved too, in his own silent way. They'd talked about adoption once, but the cost and the paperwork and the uncertainty had overwhelmed them. So it had just been the 2 of them. For 51 years, just the 2 of them. Bernard had died 3 years ago. Lung cancer. Decades of breathing and whatever they put in the air at the mill had finally caught up with him. He'd lasted 6 months after the diagnosis. Lillian had nursed him at home until the very end, sleeping in a chair beside the hospital bed they'd set up in the living room, holding his hand while he labored to breathe. When he'd finally gone, she'd felt something inside her break that she knew would never heal. She lived on Social Security now, $973 a month. Bernard's pension had died with him. The mill had gone bankrupt 8 years ago, and the pension fund had dissolved. Lillian had fought it, had called lawyers who told her there was nothing to be done. So $973 was what she had. After property taxes, utilities, and insurance, she had maybe $200 left each month for food and everything else. She ate 1 meal a day. She kept the heat at 55 in winter. She hadn't bought new clothes in 6 years, but 18 months ago, something had changed. Something that gave her a reason to get up in the morning. The first cat had appeared in early spring, a small calico, thin and limping, with a wound on her front leg that looked infected. The cat had been sitting on Lillian's porch when she'd opened the door one morning, looking up at her with exhausted, desperate eyes. Lillian had never been much of an animal person. Bernard had been allergic. But something about the cat's expression had reached her. She'd gone back inside, opened a can of tuna, and put it on a paper plate. The cat had eaten like she was starving. probably was starving. When she'd finished, she'd looked at Lillian again, and Lillian had seen something in her eyes that looked like gratitude. The cat had left, but she'd come back the next day, and the day after that. Lillian had started buying cheap cat food at the dollar store. Just one small can a day, 49 cents. She could afford that if she skipped her morning coffee. The cat, Lillian had started calling her Patches, had started staying longer, sleeping on the porch, always nearby. Then other cats had started appearing. Word had spread somehow, the way it does among strays. A black Tom with half an ear missing, a gray tabby so thin you could see every rib, a tiny orange kitten who couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old. They'd come to Lillian's porch because they knew she'd feed them, because she was the only one who would. Lillian had learned later that they were all strays from the old industrial area 3 blocks away. The factories had closed, the buildings abandoned, and the people who'd worked there had moved away, leaving their cats behind. Dozens of them, maybe more, trying to survive in empty lots and condemned buildings. Most died. The ones who found their way to Lillian's porch were the lucky ones. She'd started feeding them all. It took more of her money than she could really afford. She was spending nearly $60 a month on cat food now. But she couldn't stand to see them hungry. She'd cut back on her own food, eating toast for dinner most nights, or just skipping it altogether. Her hands shook more than they used to. Her vision was blurry. Her doctor had told her last year that she was malnourished, that she needed to eat more protein, more vegetables. Lillian had nodded and smiled and had gone home and opened another can of cat food. The cats had become her family. She'd named them all: Patches, Shadow, Ginger, Smoke, Whiskers, Tiny, Bella, Scout. 9 regulars now, sometimes more. They'd wait on her porch every morning and every evening, sitting in patient rows, their eyes following her through the window. When she'd come out with the bowls, they'd gather around her, purring, brushing against her legs. They trusted her. And that trust meant everything to Lillian. She'd tried to do more. She'd called animal control once, asking if they could help with spaying and neutering. The woman on the phone had told her there was a 6-month waiting list and a fee of $75 per cat. Lillian had thanked her and hung up. She didn't have 6 months. She didn't have $75 per cat. So she just kept feeding them, hoping it was enough. But 3 months ago, one of her neighbors had complained. A man named Gary Preston, who'd moved in next door 2 years ago. He'd knocked on Lillian's door one evening, his face red with anger. "You need to stop feeding those cats. They're everywhere. They're loud. They're tearing up my garbage." Lillian had apologized. "I'm sorry. I'm just trying to help them. They were starving." "I don't care. They're a nuisance, and your yard is a mess. It's bringing down property values. I do the best I can." "Well, your best isn't good enough. Stop feeding them or I'm calling the city." Lillian had tried to be more careful after that. She'd fed the cats only early in the morning and late at night, hoping Gary wouldn't notice. But the cats didn't understand schedules. They'd gather on her porch throughout the day, waiting, meowing. And Gary had noticed. He'd made good on his threat. He'd called code enforcement. And 2 weeks later, a city inspector had shown up. Before we continue, I need to ask, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments. And listen, if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and hit that like button, because sometimes the people who need our voices most are the ones society has forgotten. Stories like Lillian's don't just need to be heard, they need to be shared everywhere. Because what happens next is going to remind you why compassion matters more than any ordinance ever written. His name was Todd Brenner. and he was 38 years old. He'd been working in code enforcement for the city for 9 years, and he approached his job with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed having power over others. He drove a city truck, wore a uniform with a badge, carried a clipboard. To Todd, every violation was personal, every citation an opportunity to remind people that he was the authority, and they were not. He'd arrived at Lillian's house on a Thursday morning in late September. The weather was cold, the sky gray, and threatening rain. Lillian had been on her porch, setting out bowls of food for the morning feeding. The cats had been gathered around her, 9 of them, maybe 10, rubbing against her legs, purring. Lillian had been talking to them softly, the way she always did. "Good morning, Patches. Did you sleep well? Ginger, don't push. There's enough for everyone." Todd had parked on the street and had walked up the driveway without announcing himself. When he'd reached the porch, his voice had been loud and accusatory. "Ma'am, are you the resident here?" Lillian had looked up, startled. The sudden noise had scared the cats. Several had scattered. "Yes, I'm Lillian Mosher. Who are you?" Todd had pulled out his badge. "Code enforcement. We've received a complaint about you feeding stray animals. That's a violation of City Ordinance 9-247. You're creating a public nuisance." Lillian's face had gone pale. "I'm not trying to create a nuisance. These cats were starving. I'm just—" "Ma'am, I don't need your life story. You're in violation. I'm issuing a warning. If we receive another complaint, you'll be fined." "But what am I supposed to do? Let them starve? That's not my problem. The ordinance is clear. No feeding of stray or wild animals on residential property. You stop, or you pay." He'd handed her a printed warning on city letterhead, turned, and left without another word. Lillian had stood there on her porch, the papers shaking in her hands, tears running down her face. The cats had slowly come back, cautious now, sensing her distress. She'd finished feeding them, her hands trembling so badly she'd spilled half the food. She'd tried to stop. She really had. For 3 days, she'd left the bowls empty. But watching the cats wait on her porch, confused and hungry, had been unbearable. Patches had looked at her through the window with those same desperate eyes from the first day they'd met. Tiny, the orange kitten, had been so weak he could barely stand. On the 4th day, Lillian had given in. She'd fed them again. Gary Preston had been watching. He'd taken photos with his phone. Lillian on her porch, the bowls, the cats. He'd sent them to the city with another complaint, this one more detailed. Repeat offender, warned once, still violating, health hazard, request immediate enforcement. And Todd Brenner had come back. That was this morning. He'd pulled up in his truck, gotten out with his clipboard, and had walked up to Lillian's porch where she'd been feeding the cats. His face had been set in a hard expression, his jaw tight. He'd been angry that she'd ignored his warning, angry that he had to come back, angry that she'd made his job more difficult. He'd slapped the citation down on the porch railing so hard that several of the cats had bolted. The paper had been thick, official, with the city seal at the top. $3,000, ma'am, and if I catch you feeding those animals again, it's jail time. Lillian's hands had started shaking. She'd tried to pick up the citation, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. $3,000? I don't have that kind of money. Todd's voice had been loud, deliberately loud. Gary Preston was watching from his window next door, and Todd wanted him to see this, wanted him to see that. The city took complaints seriously. I don't care if you're broke, figure it out. You were warned. You ignored the warning. Now you pay the consequences. Lillian had tried to explain, her voice trembling. Please, I was just trying to help them. They were abandoned. They were dying. I don't want to hear it. Todd had cut her off, his hand slicing through the air dismissively. You think you're some kind of hero, feeding stray animals? You're creating a health hazard. You're violating city ordinance. You're making this neighborhood look like a dump. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I just didn't know what else to do. Todd had looked down at the small bowl of cat food at Lillian's feet. Then, deliberately, he'd kicked it. The bowl had flipped over, kibble scattering across the porch and falling between the cracks in the boards. The cats had scattered again, frightened. Lillian had gasped, her hand going to her mouth. That's what I think of your charity, Todd had said. $3,000, 30 days to pay. If you don't, we'll put a lien on your property. He'd pulled out his phone and had started taking photos. Of Lillian's face, wet with tears. Of the scattered cat food, of the cats running away. Evidence, he'd said, for my report. Shows you were actively in violation when I arrived. Lillian had been crying openly now, her shoulders shaking. Please, I'll stop, I promise. Just please don't take my house. Should have thought about that before. Todd had turned and walked back toward his truck, tucking his phone in his pocket, feeling satisfied. Another violation handled, another message sent. Don't mess with city ordinances. But as he'd reached for the truck door handle, something had caught his eye. Words carved into the wooden post beside Lillian's front door. He'd glanced at them, then looked away. Then looked back, his eyes widening. He'd walked closer, squinting at the weathered carving. The letters were old, carved deep into the wood, the edges smoothed by years of weather. 5 words. Bernard and Lillian's Kitty Sanctuary. And beneath it, in smaller letters, a date. May 2021. Todd's hand had frozen on the door handle. May 2021. That was 5 months after Bernard had died. He'd stared at the carving, his mind putting the pieces together slowly. This wasn't just some old woman feeding strays. This was deliberate. This was a promise. He'd turned back toward the porch. Lillian was on her hands and knees now, trying to pick up the scattered cat food with shaking, arthritic fingers, tears dripping onto the wood. The cats were watching from a distance, scared but unwilling to leave. Todd had felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Something uncomfortable. He'd walked back to the porch. Mrs. Mosher. Lillian had looked up, her face wet and frightened. I'm picking it up. I'm sorry. I'll clean it all up. Mrs. Mosher, what does that sign mean? The one by your door? Lillian's voice had been barely audible. My husband, Bernard. Before he died, we talked about what I'd do after he was gone. I told him I was scared of being alone. He said... Her voice broke. He said I should find something to care for. Something that needed me. He carved that sign for me 3 weeks before he passed. He said it would remind me. Todd had stood there, silent, staring at the old woman on her knees, picking up cat food 1 piece at a time. You mean he wanted you to do this? He wanted me to have a purpose, to not give up. Lillian had looked at the cats, now slowly creeping back toward the porch. These cats are all I have. They're why I get up in the morning. They're why I keep going. Todd's face had gone white. He'd just threatened to take away this woman's home. The home she'd shared with her husband, the home where his last gift to her was carved into the doorpost. Because she was honoring his dying wish. He'd just kicked over food meant for animals she was caring for as an act of love and grief. He'd stood there for a long moment. Then he'd bent down, slowly, and had started helping Lillian pick up the cat food. His hands had been shaking now, too. Mrs. Mosher, I need you to stand up, please. Lillian had struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on the porch railing. Todd had looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Saw how thin she was, how her clothes hung loose on her frame. Saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the sadness that seemed to live permanently in the lines of her face. Saw her hands, gnarled with arthritis, still trembling. "Mrs. Mosher, I'm going to tear up this citation." Lillian had blinked. "What?" "I'm tearing it up. You're not paying $3,000. He'd pulled the citation off the railing, had ripped it in half, then in half again. "This was wrong. I was wrong. I don't understand." "I didn't ask questions. I just saw a violation and enforced it. I didn't see you. I'm sorry." He looked at the carved sign again. "I lost my father 2 years ago. If he'd left me something like that, and someone tried to take it away." His voice had trailed off. Lillian had started crying again, but differently now. Relief, confusion, disbelief all mixed together. "So I can keep feeding them?" "I don't know. The ordinance is real. But there has to be a better way than this." Todd had pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my supervisor, and if he won't help, I'm going above him." What happened next happened fast. Todd had called his supervisor from Lillian's porch. He'd explained the situation, the carved sign, Bernard's dying wish, Lillian's situation. His supervisor, a man named Jim Crawford, who'd been with the city for 23 years, had listened. His response had been curt. "The ordinance is the ordinance, Todd. I don't care about the backstory. She's in violation. Jim, she's 86 years old. She's broke. She's feeding cats her dead husband told her to care for. We can't fine her $3,000. We're not fining her. You already did. That's the penalty schedule. Non-negotiable." "Then I'm undoing it. I tore up the citation." There had been a long silence. "You what?" "I tore it up. I'm not enforcing this." "Todd, you don't have the authority to." "I don't care. I'm not doing it. And if you have a problem with that, you can come down here and issue it yourself." Todd had hung up. He'd looked at Lillian. "I might have just lost my job." But he hadn't lost his job. Because 30 minutes later, Jim Crawford had shown up. Not to enforce the citation, to see for himself. Jim had walked up to Lillian's porch, had seen the carved sign, had talked to Lillian for 20 minutes. He'd listened to her story about Bernard, about the cats, about why she couldn't stop. And something had shifted in his face. "Mrs. Mosher, I'm going to talk to the city attorney. There might be a way around this. But I need you to do something for me. Anything. Stop feeding them on the front porch. The neighbor can see it, and he'll keep complaining. Feed them in your backyard instead, out of sight." Lillian had nodded eagerly. "I can do that." Jim had turned to Todd. "You and I are going to have a conversation later about tearing up citations. But for now, you did the right thing." But the story didn't stay quiet. Because Gary Preston, furious that the citation had been torn up, had called a local news station. He'd complained about the city's selective enforcement, about how he'd reported a violation and nothing had been done. He'd sent them the photos of Lillian feeding the cats. The reporter who'd taken the call was a woman named Rachel Kim. She'd initially planned to do a quick piece about neighborhood disputes and city ordinances. But when she'd arrived at Lillian's house and had seen the carved sign, when Lillian had told her about Bernard, when she'd learned that Lillian was spending most of her food budget on cat food for strays no one else wanted, Rachel had realized this was a different story. The piece had aired 2 days later. It showed Lillian's small, run-down house. It showed the carved sign. It showed the cats, healthy and well-fed despite everything. And it showed Lillian, 86 years old and frail, explaining in her soft, shaking voice why she couldn't stop. My husband told me to care for them. It was the last thing he asked me to do. How can I stop? They'd die. And if they die, then what was the point of any of it? The response had been immediate and overwhelming. The news station's phone lines had been flooded with calls. People wanting to help. People outraged that the city had tried to fine an elderly widow for honoring her husband's dying wish. Donations had poured in. Within 48 hours, over $17,000 had been raised. A local veterinary clinic had reached out, offering to spay and neuter all of Lillian's cats for free. An animal rescue organization had contacted her, offering to help set up a proper feeding station and register her property as a managed feral colony site, which made it legal under a city program Lillian hadn't even known existed. A contractors association had seen the story and had volunteered to repair Lillian's house, the roof, the gutters, the porch, all of it, at no cost. The mayor, facing intense public pressure, had ordered a review of the city's animal ordinances. A task force had been formed, including representatives from animal welfare groups, to create a more humane approach to managing stray animals. And Gary Preston had become infamous. His name had been mentioned in the news coverage, not by Rachel Kim, but by neighbors she'd interviewed who'd volunteered the information. Gary Preston reported her. He's the one who called the city. His social media accounts had been flooded with angry messages. His employer, a local insurance company, had received complaints. Within a week, Gary had put his house up for sale. Todd Brenner had been quietly commended by the mayor for his compassion and good judgment. Jim Crawford had made sure that commendation was public. Todd had received dozens of letters and emails from residents thanking him for standing up for Lillian. He'd kept every single one. But the most profound change had been in Lillian herself. Stop right here for a second. This is one of those moments where everything could have gone differently. If Todd hadn't looked at that sign, if he'd just driven away, if nobody had cared, think about how many stories like this end badly because nobody pays attention. Drop a comment if you think local officials should be required to consider circumstances before slapping life-destroying fines on vulnerable people. And share this video. Because what happened to Lillian next is proof that sometimes the world gets it right when enough people refuse to be silent. With the donations, Lillian's life had transformed. She'd paid off her back property taxes. She'd stocked her freezer and pantry for the first time in years. She'd gone to the doctor and had gotten her medications adjusted, started eating regular meals, started gaining weight. Her hands still shook, but less now. Her eyes were brighter. The veterinary clinic had spayed and neutered all 9 of her regular cats, plus 3 more who'd shown up since the story aired. The animal rescue had built her a proper shelter in her backyard, weatherproof feeding stations, and had registered her address as an official managed colony site. They'd even assigned a volunteer to check on her weekly, to make sure she had enough supplies, to make sure she was okay. But more than the material help, Lillian had received something she'd been missing since Bernard died. Community. Neighbors she'd never met had stopped by to introduce themselves, to thank her, to offer help. Children from the elementary school had drawn pictures of cats and had delivered them to her house. The local newspaper had done a follow-up story, calling her the Guardian of Crescent Street. The Thar group of volunteers had formed something they called Bernard's Brigade, dedicated to helping other elderly people in the city who were caring for stray animals. They'd started a fund to provide free spay, neuter services, food assistance, and legal support. Within 6 months, They'd helped 23 other people avoid the same fate Lillian had almost suffered. And Lillian had become an advocate. She'd spoken at city council meetings about the need for humane animal ordinances. She'd visited schools to talk about compassion and kindness. At 86, she'd found her voice. Lillian lived another 6 years. She died peacefully in her sleep at 92, in the house she'd shared with Bernard, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. The cats, fewer now, as the spay-neuter program had reduced the population, had been cared for by Bernard's brigade, who'd made sure every one of them found homes or continued care. At her funeral, Todd Brenner had spoken. He'd talked about the day he'd almost destroyed her life, about the carved sign that had stopped him, about the lesson she'd taught him. Lillian showed me that rules exist to serve people, not to punish them. That compassion is stronger than compliance. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're wrong and choose to be better. The carved sign, Bernard and Lillian's kitty sanctuary, had been preserved by the city. It hung now in the lobby of the Animal Control Building, a reminder to every employee who walked past it. Beneath it, a plaque. In memory of Lillian Mosher, who taught us that love transcends loss, that purpose can be found in the smallest acts of kindness, and that true strength is caring for those who cannot care for themselves. Every year, on the anniversary of Bernard's death, volunteers from Bernard's brigade gathered at Lillian's old house and released balloons. They'd tell her story to anyone who'd listen. About the widow who'd honored her husband's dying wish. About the code enforcement officer who'd found his conscience. About the community that had rallied around one elderly woman, and in doing so, had become better. Because sometimes justice isn't about enforcing rules. It's about recognizing that the person in front of you has a story, has already lost more than you know, and is doing the best they can with what they have left. And sometimes, all it takes is 5 words carved into a wooden post to remind us what really matters. Bernard and Lillian's kitty sanctuary. 5 words that changed everything. So here's my final question for you. Have you ever seen someone get punished for showing compassion? For feeding the hungry, caring for the forgotten, or honoring a promise to someone they loved? Drop your story in the comments. Because Lillian's story proves that when enough people pay attention, cruelty can't hide behind ordinances and policies. And if this story reminded you why kindness matters more than rules, hit that subscribe button and share this everywhere. Because somewhere right now, there's another Lillian being threatened by another Todd. And the only difference between her story ending in tragedy or triumph is whether people like you decide to pay attention. What's it going to be?